The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 2. Food was abundant, varied, and well prepared, except that lack of refrigeration soon made meats high and put a premium on spices that could preserve or disguise. Some spices were imported from the Orient, but as these were costly, other spices were grown in domestic gardens: parsley, mustard, sage, savory, anise, garlic, dill. Cookbooks were numerous and complex. In a great establishment, the cook was a man of importance, bearing on his shoulders the dignity and reputation of the house. He was equipped with a gleaming armory of copper cauldrons, kettles, and pans, and prided himself on serving dishes that would please the eye as well as the palate. Meat, poultry, and eggs were cheap, though still dear enough to make most of the poor unwilling vegetarians. Peasants flourished on coarse whole-grain bread of barley, oats, or rye, baked in their homes. City dwellers preferred white bread, baked by bakers, as a mark of caste. There were no potatoes, coffee, or tea, but nearly all meats and vegetables now used in Europe, including eels, frogs, and snails, were eaten by medieval man. By the time of Charlemagne, the European acclimatization of Asiatic fruits and nuts was almost complete. Oranges, however, were still a rarity in the 13th century north of the Alps and the Pyrenees. The commonest meat was pork. Pigs ate the refuse in the streets, and people ate the pigs. It was widely believed that pork caused leprosy, but this did not lessen the taste for it. Great sausages and black puddings were a medieval delight. Lordly hosts might have a whole roast pig or boar brought to the table, and carve it before their gaping guests. This was a delicacy almost as keenly relished as partridges, quails, thrushes, peacocks, and cranes. Fish was a staple food. Herring was a main recourse of soldiers, sailors, and the poor. Dairy products were less used than today, but the cheese of Brie was already renowned. Salads were unknown, and confections were rare. Sugar was still an import, and had not yet replaced honey for sweetening. Desserts were usually of fruits and nuts. Pastries were innumerable, and jolly bakers, quite unreproved, gave cakes and buns the most interesting shapes imaginable. Quaedam pudenda muliebra alii virilia. It seems incredible that there was no after-dinner smoking. Both sexes drank instead. As unboiled water was seldom safe, all classes found substitutes for it in beer and wine. Drinkwater and boileau were unusual names, indicating unusual tastes. Cider or perry was made from apples or pears, and provided cheap intoxicants for the peasantry. Drunkenness was a favorite vice of the Middle Ages in all classes and sexes. Taverns were numerous, ale was cheap. Beer was the regular drink of the poor, even at breakfast. Monasteries and hospitals north of the Alps were normally allowed a gallon of ale or beer per person per day. Many monasteries, castles, and rich homes had their own breweries, for in the northern countries beer was reckoned as second only to bread as a necessary of life. Among the well-to-do of all nations, and in all ranks of Latin Europe, wine was preferred. France produced the most famous wines and proclaimed their glory in 1,000 popular songs. At vintage time, the peasants worked harder than usual, and were rewarded by good abbots with a moral holiday. A customel of the Abbey of St. Peter in the Black Forest includes some tender clauses. When the peasants have unladen the wine, they shall be brought into the monastery, and shall have meat and drink in abundance. A great tub shall be set there and filled with wine, and each shall drink, and if they wax drunken and smite the cellarman or the cook, they shall pay no fine for this deed, and they shall drink so that two of them cannot beat the third to the wagon. After a banquet, the host would usually offer entertainment by jugglers, tumblers, players, minstrels, or buffoons. Some manor houses had their own staff of such entertainers. Some rich men kept jesters whose merry impudence and ribald humor could be vented without fear and without reproach. If the diners preferred to provide their own amusement, they could tell stories, hear or make music, dance, flirt, play backgammon, chess, or parlor games. Even barons and baronesses romped about in forfeits and blind man's buff. Playing cards were still unknown. French laws of 1256 and 1291 forbade making or playing with dice, but gambling with dice was widespread nonetheless, and moralists told of fortunes and souls lost in the game. Gambling was not always forbidden by law. Siena provided booths for it in the public square. Chess was prohibited by a council at Paris in 1213 and by an edict of Louis IX in 1254. No one paid much attention to these demurrers. The game became a consuming pastime among the aristocracy and gave its name to the royal exchequer, a checkered table or chessboard on which the revenues of the state were reckoned. In Dante's youth, A Saracen player set all Florence agape by playing 3 games of chess at once against the best players of the city. He looked at one board and kept the plays on the other 2 in his head. Of the 3 games he won 2 and tied the 3rd. The game of checkers was played in France as dames, in England as draughts. Dancing was condemned by preachers and was practiced by nearly all persons except those dedicated to religion. St. Thomas Aquinas, with characteristic moderation, allowed dancing at weddings or on the homecoming of a friend from abroad or to celebrate some national victory, and the hearty saint went so far as to say that dancing, if kept decent, was a very healthy exercise. Albertus Magnus showed a like liberality, but medieval moralists generally reprobated the dance as an invention of the devil. The Church frowned upon it as a provocative of immorality. The young blades of the Middle Ages did their best to justify her suspicions. The French and Germans in particular were fond of the dance and developed many folk dances to mark the festivals of the agricultural year, to celebrate victories, or to sustain public spirit in depression or plague. One of the Carmina Burana describes the dances of girls in the fields as among the sweetest pleasures of spring. When knighthood was conferred, all the knights of the vicinity gathered in full armor and performed evolutions on horseback or on foot, while the populace danced around them to the accompaniment of martial music. Dancing could become an epidemic. In 1237 a band of German children danced all the way from Erfurt to Arnstadt. Many died en route, and some survivors suffered to the end of their lives from St. Vitus's dance or other nervous disorders. Most dancing took place by day and in the open air. Houses were poorly lit at night, by standing or hanging lamps with wick and oil, or a rushlight torch of mutton fat, and as fat and oils were expensive, very little work or reading was done after sunset. Soon after dark the guests dispersed and the household retired. Bedrooms seldom sufficed. It was not uncommon to find an extra bed in the hall or reception room. The poor slept well on beds of straw. The rich slept poorly on perfumed pillows and feather mattresses. Lordly beds were overhung with mosquito netting or a canopy, and were mounted with the aid of stools. Several persons of any age or sex might sleep in the same room. In England and France, all classes slept nude. 8. Society and Sport. The general coarseness of medieval manners was smoothed by certain graces of feudal courtesy. Men shook hands on meeting as a pledge of peace through unreadiness to draw a sword. Titles were innumerable in 100 grades of dignity, and by a charming custom each dignitary was addressed by his title and his Christian name, or the name of his estate. A code of manners was drawn up for polite society in any circumstance, at home, at the dance, on the street, at tournament, at court. Ladies had to learn how to walk, curtsy, ride horseback, play, carry falcons gracefully on the wrist. All this, and a like code for men, constituted courtoisie, the manners of the court, or courtesy. The 13th century saw the publication of many guides to etiquette. In traveling, one expected courtesies and hospitality from persons of his own class. The poor for charity, the rich for fee or gift, would be sheltered en route by convents or monasteries. As early as the 8th century, monks established hospices in the passes of the Alps. Some monasteries had great guest houses capable of sheltering 300 wayfarers and stabling their horses. Most travelers, however, put up at wayside inns. Rates were low there, and a wench might be had at a reasonable rate if one guarded his purse. Offered such comforts, many braved the dangers of travel: merchants, bankers, priests, diplomats, pilgrims, students, monks, tourists, tramps. The highways of the Middle Ages, however discouraging, were alive with curious and hopeful people who thought that they would be happier somewhere else. Class distinctions were as sharp in amusement as in travel. The mighty and the lowly mingled now and then, when the king held a public assembly of his vassals and distributed food to the crowd, when the aristocratic cavalry performed martial maneuvers, when some prince or princess, king or queen, entered the city in panoplied state, and masses lined the highway to feed on pageantry, or when a tournament or trial by combat was opened to the public eye. Planned spectacles were a vital part of medieval life. Church processions, political parades, guild celebrations filled the streets with banners, floats, wax saints, fat merchants, prancing knights, and military bands. Traveling mummers staged short plays in the village or city square. Minstrels sang and played and strummed romantic tales. Acrobats tumbled and juggled, and men and women walked or danced on tight ropes across mortal chasms. Or 2 blindfolded men belabored each other with sticks, or a circus would come to town, exhibit strange animals and stranger men, and pit one animal against another in combat to the death. Among the nobility, hunting rivaled jousting as the royal sport. Game laws restricted the season to brief periods, and poaching laws kept game preserves for the aristocracy. The woods of Europe were still inhabited by beasts who had not yet acknowledged the victory of man in the war for the planet. Medieval Paris, for example, was several times invaded by wolves. In one aspect, the hunter was engaged in maintaining man's precarious ascendancy. In another, he was adding to the food supply. And not least, he was preparing himself for inevitable war by hardening body and spirit to danger, combat, and the shedding of blood. At the same time, he made this too a pageant. Great elephants, hunting horns of ivory, sometimes chased with gold, rounded up the ladies and gentlemen and dogs, women sitting daintily side-saddle on prancing steeds, men in colorful attire and varied armament, bow and arrow, small axe, spear, and knife, greyhounds, staghounds, bloodhounds, boarhounds pulling on the leash. If the chase led across a peasant's fields, the baron, his vassals, and his guests were free to cross them at whatever cost to seeds and crops, and only reckless peasants would complain. The French aristocracy organized hunting into a system, gave it the name of chasse, and developed for it a complex ritual and etiquette. The ladies joined with a special flair in the most aristocratic game of all, falconry. Nearly all great estates had aviaries housing a variety of birds, of which the falcon was the most prized. It was taught to perch on my lord or lady's wrist at any time. Some piquant dames kept them so while hearing Mass. The Emperor Frederick II wrote an excellent book on falconry, running to 589 pages, and introduced into Europe from Islam the custom of controlling the nerves and curiosity of the bird by covering its head with a leather hood. Different varieties were trained to fly up and attack divers birds, kill or wound them, and return to the hunter's wrist. There, lured and rewarded by a bit of meat, they allowed their feet to be snared in straps until fresh prey flew into view. A well-trained falcon was almost the finest gift that could be made to noble or king. The Duke of Burgundy ransomed his son by sending 12 white hawks to the captor, Sultan Bajazet. The office of Grand Falconer of France was one of the highest and best paid in the kingdom. Many another sport made tolerable the summer's heat and the winter's cold, and turned the passions and energies of youth to vital skills. Practically every lad learned to swim, and in the north all learned to skate. Horse racing was popular, especially in Italy. All classes practiced archery, but only the working classes had the leisure to fish. There were divers games of bowling, hockey, quoits, wrestling, boxing, tennis, football. Tennis developed in France, probably from Moslem antecedents. The name was apparently derived from the tenez, or play, with which a player announced his serve. The sport became so popular in France and England that it was sometimes played before large crowds in theaters or the open air. The Irish played hockey as early as our 2nd century, and a Byzantine historian of the 12th century gives a vivid description of a polo match played with cord-strung rackets, as in lacrosse. Football, says a horrified medieval chronicler, is an abominable game wherein young people propel a huge ball not by throwing it into the air, but by striking and rolling it along the ground, not with their hands, but with their feet. Apparently the game had come from China to Italy to England, where it became so popular and violent in the 13th century that Edward II banned it as leading to breaches of the peace, this in 1314. Life was more social then than later. Group activities stirred the monasteries, nunneries, universities, villages, guilds. Life was especially hilarious on Sundays and solemn holy days. Then the peasant, the merchant, and the lord dressed their best, prayed the longest, drank the most. On May Day the English raised maypoles, lit bonfires, and danced around them in semi-conscious recollection of pagan fertility feasts. At Christmas time many towns and chateaux appointed a lord of misrule to organize pastimes and spectacles for the populace. Mummers in masks and beards and jolly garb went about performing street plays or pranks or singing Christmas carols. Houses and churches were decked with holly, ivy, and whatsoever the season afforded to be green. There were festivals for the agricultural seasons, for national or local triumphs, for saints and for guilds, and rare was the man who on those occasions did not drink his fill. Merry England had Scot ales, or money-raising bazaars at which ale flowed fast but not free. The Church denounced these festivities in the 13th century and adopted them in the 15th. Some festivals adapted the ceremonies of the Church to boisterous parodies that ranged from simple humor to scandalous satire. Beauvais, Sens, and other French towns through many years celebrated on January 14th a Fête de l'Âne, or Festival of the Ass. A pretty girl was placed on an ass, apparently to represent Mary on the flight to Egypt. The ass was led into a church, was made to genuflect, was stationed beside the altar, and heard a mass and hymns sung in its praise. And at the end both the priest and the congregation brayed thrice in honor of the animal that had saved the Mother of God from Herod and borne Jesus into Jerusalem. A dozen cities of France celebrated annually, usually on the feast of the circumcision, a fête des fous, or Feast of Fools. On that day, the lower clergy were allowed to revenge themselves for their subordination to priest and bishop during the year by taking over the church and the ritual. They dressed themselves in feminine costumes or in ecclesiastical vestments turned inside out. They chose one of their number to be Episcopus Fatuorum, or Fool's Bishop. They chanted ribald hymns, ate sausages on the altar, played dice at its foot, burned old shoes in the censer, and preached hilarious sermons. In the 13th and 14th centuries, many towns in England, Germany, and France chose an Episcopus Puerorum, or boy's bishop, to lead his fellows in a good-humored imitation of ecclesiastical ceremonies. The local clergy smiled on these popular buffooneries. The church closed her eyes to them for a long time, but as they tended to ever greater irreverence and indecency, she was forced to condemn them, and they finally disappeared in the 16th century. A boy's bishop, however, is still annually elected at Addlestone, Surrey, England. In general, the church was lenient with the lusty humor of the age of faith. She knew that men must have a moral holiday now and then, a moratorium on the unnatural moral restraints normally necessary to a civilized society. Some ultra-Puritans like St. John Chrysostom might cry out, "Christ is crucified, and yet you laugh." But there continued to be cakes and ale, and wine ran hot in the mouth. St. Bernard was suspicious of mirth and beauty, but most churchmen in the 13th century were hearty livers who enjoyed their meat and drink with a good conscience and took no offense at a well-turned joke or ankle. The age of faith was not so solemn after all. Rather, it was an age of abounding vitality and full-blooded merriment, and tender sentiment, and a simple joy in the blessings of the earth. On the back of a medieval vocabulary book, some wistful student wrote a wish for all of us. "And I wish that all times were April and May, and every month renew all fruits again, and every day fleur-de-lis and gillyflower and violets and roses wherever one goes, and woods in leaf and meadows green, and every lover should have his lass, and they to love each other with a sure heart and true, and to every one his pleasure and a gay heart." 9. Morality and Religion. Does the general picture of medieval Europe support the belief that religion makes for morality? Our general impression suggests a wider gap between moral theory and practice in the Middle Ages than in other epochs of civilization. Medieval Christendom was apparently as rich as our own irreligious age in sensuality, violence, drunkenness, cruelty, coarseness, profanity, greed, robbery, dishonesty, and fraud. It seems to have outdone our time in the enslavement of individuals, but not to have rivaled it in the economic enslavement of colonial areas or defeated states. It surpassed us in the subjection of women. It hardly equaled us in immodesty, fornication, and adultery, or in the immensity and murderousness of war. Compared with the Roman Empire from Nerva to Aurelius, medieval Christendom was a moral setback. But much of the empire had in Nerva's day enjoyed many centuries of civilization, while the Middle Ages, through most of their duration, represented a struggle between Christian morality and a virile barbarism that largely ignored the ethics of the religion whose theology it indifferently received. The barbarians would have called some of their vices virtues, as necessary to their time. Their violence as the other side of courage, their sensuality as animal health, their coarse and direct speech, and their shameless talk about natural things as no worse than the introverted prudery of our youth. It would be an easy matter to condemn medieval Christendom from the mouths of its own moralists. St. Francis bemoaned the 13th century as these times of superabundant malice and iniquity. Innocent III, St. Bonaventura, Vincent de Beauvais, Dante considered the morals of that wonderful century to be dishearteningly gross. And Bishop Grosseteste, one of the most judicious prelates of the age, told the Pope that the Catholic population as a body was incorporate with the devil. Roger Bacon, possibly 1214 to 1294, judged his time with characteristic hyperbole. "Never was so much ignorance. Far more sins reign in these days than in any past age, boundless corruption, lechery, gluttony. Yet we have baptism and the revelation of Christ, which men cannot really believe in or revere, or they would not allow themselves to be so corrupted. Therefore many wise men believe that Antichrist is at hand and the end of the world. Such passages, of course, are the exaggerations necessary to reformers, and could be matched in any age. Apparently the fear of hell had less effect in raising the moral level than the fear of public opinion or the law has now, or had then. But the public opinion, and in a measure the law, had been formed by Christianity. Probably the moral chaos, born of half a millennium of invasion, war, and devastation, would have been far worse without the moderating effect of the Christian ethic. Our selection of instances in this chapter may have been unwittingly biased. At best they are fragmentary. Statistics are lacking or unreliable, and history always leaves out the average man. There must have been in medieval Christendom thousands of good and simple people like Fra Salimbene's mother, whom he describes as a humble lady and devout, fasting much and gladly dispensing alms to the poor. But how often do such women make the pages of history? Christianity brought some moral retrogressions and some moral advances. The intellectual virtues naturally declined in the age of faith. Intellectual conscience, fairness with the facts, and the search for truth were replaced by zeal and admiration for sanctity and a sometimes unscrupulous piety. Pious frauds of textual doctoring and documentary forgery seemed negligible venial sins. The civic virtues suffered from concentration on the afterlife, but more from the disintegration of the state. Nevertheless, there must have been some patriotism, however local, in the men and women who built so many cathedrals and some lordly town halls. Perhaps hypocrisy, so indispensable to civilization, increased in the Middle Ages as compared with the frank secularism of antiquity or the unabashed corporate brutality of our time. Against these and other debits, many credits stand. Christianity struggled with heroic tenacity against an inundation of barbarism. It labored to diminish war and feud, trial by combat or ordeal. It extended the intervals of truce and peace, and sublimated something of feudal violence and pugnacity into devotion and chivalry. It suppressed the gladiatorial shows, denounced the enslavement of prisoners, forbade the enslavement of Christians, ransomed numberless captives, and encouraged, more than it practiced, the emancipation of serfs. It taught men a new respect for human life and work. It stopped infanticide, lessened abortion, and softened the penalties exacted by Roman and barbarian law. It steadfastly rejected the double standard in sexual morality. It immensely expanded the scope and operations of charity. It gave men peace of mind against the baffling riddles of the universe, though at the cost of discouraging science and philosophy. Finally, it taught men that patriotism unchecked by a higher loyalty is a tool of mass greed and crime. Over all the competing cities and petty states of Europe, it established and maintained one moral law. Under its guidance, and at some necessary sacrifice of liberty, Europe achieved for a century that international morality for which it prays and struggles today, a law that shall raise states out of their jungle code and free the energies of man for the battles and victories of peace. Chapter 31. The Resurrection of the Arts, 1095 to 1300. 1. The Aesthetic Awakening. Why is it that Western Europe, in the 12th and 13th centuries, reached a climax of art comparable with Periclean Athens and Augustan Rome? The Norse and Saracen raids had been beaten off, the Magyars had been tamed. The Crusades aroused a fever of creative energy and brought back to Europe 1,000 ideas and art forms from the Byzantine and Moslem East. The reopening of the Mediterranean and the opening of the Atlantic to Christian commerce, the security and organization of trade along the rivers of France and Germany and on the northern seas, and the expansion of industry and finance generated a wealth unknown since Constantine, new classes capable of affording art, and prosperous communes each resolved to build a finer cathedral than the last. The coffers of abbots, bishops, and popes were swelling with the tithes of the people, the gifts of the merchants, the grants of nobles and kings. The iconoclasts had been defeated. Art was no longer branded as idolatry. The Church, which once had feared it, found in it now a propitious medium for inculcating her faith and ideals among the letterless, and for stirring souls to a devotion that lifted spires like supplicating litanies to the sky. And the new religion of Mary, rising spontaneously from the hearts of the people, poured its love and trust of the Divine Mother into magnificent temples where thousands of her children might gather at once to do her homage and beg her aid. All these influences, and many more, came together to flood half a continent with profuse streams of unprecedented art. The ancient techniques had here and there survived barbarian devastation and municipal decay. In the Eastern Empire, the old skills were never lost, and it was above all from the Greek East and Byzantine Italy that artists and art themes now entered the life of the resurrected West. Charlemagne drew into his service Greek artists fleeing from Byzantine iconoclasts. Hence, the art of Aachen married Byzantine delicacy and mysticism to German solidity and earthiness. The monk artists of Cluny, inaugurating in the 10th century a new era in Western architecture and adornment, began by copying Byzantine models. The school of monastic art developed at Monte Cassino by Abbot Desiderius in 1072 was taught by Greek teachers on Byzantine lines. When Honorius III in 1218 wished to decorate San Paolo fuori le mura, he sent to Venice for mosaicists, and those who came were steeped in the Byzantine tradition. Colonies of Byzantine artists could be found in a score of western cities, and it was their style of painting that molded Duccio, Cimabue, and the early Giotto himself. Byzantine or Oriental motives, palmettes, acanthus leaves, animals within medallions, came to the West on textiles and ivories and in illuminated manuscripts, and lived hundreds of years in Romanesque ornament. Syrian, Anatolian, Persian forms of architecture, the vault, the dome, the tower-flanked facade, the composite column, the windows grouped by 2 or 3 under a binding arch, appeared again in the architecture of the West. History makes no leaps, and nothing is lost. Just as the development of life requires variation as well as heredity, and the development of a society needs experimental innovation as well as stabilizing custom, so the development of art in Western Europe involved not only the continuity of a tradition in skills and forms, and the stimulation of Byzantine and Moslem examples, but also the repeated turning of the artist from the school to nature, from ideas to things, from the past to the present, from the imitation of models to the expression of self. There was a somber and static quality in Byzantine art, a fragile and feminine elegance in Arabic ornament that could never represent the dynamic and masculine vitality of a re-barbarized and reinvigorated West. Nations that were rising out of the Dark Ages toward the noon of the 13th century preferred the noble grace of Giotto's women to the stiff Theodorus of Byzantine mosaics. And laughing at the Semitic horror of images, they transformed mere decoration into the smiling angel of the Reims Cathedral and the Golden Virgin of Amiens. The joy of life conquered the fear of death in Gothic art. It was the monks who, as they preserved classic literature, maintained and disseminated Roman, Greek, and Oriental art techniques. Seeking self-containment, the monasteries trained their inmates to the decorative as well as the practical crafts. The abbey church required altar and chancel furniture, chalice and pyx, reliquaries and shrines, missal, candelabra, perhaps mosaics, murals, and icons to inform and inspire piety. These monks, for the most part, fashioned with their own hands. Indeed, the monastery itself was in many cases designed and built by them, as Monte Cassino rises by Benedictine labor today. Most monasteries included spacious workshops. At Chartres, for example, Bernard de Tiron founded a religious house and gathered into it, we are told, craftsmen both in wood and iron, carvers and goldsmiths, painters and stonemasons, and others skilled in all manner of cunning work. The illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages were almost all the work of monks. The finest textiles were produced by monks and nuns. The architects of the early Romanesque cathedrals were monks. In the 11th and early 12th centuries, the Abbey of Cluny furnished most of the architects for Western Europe and many of the painters and sculptors. And in the 13th century, the Abbey of Saint-Denis was a thriving center of varied arts. Even the Cistercian monasteries, which in the days of the watchful Bernard had closed their doors to decoration, soon surrendered to the lure of form and the excitement of color, and began to build abbeys as ornate as Cluny or Saint-Denis. As the English cathedrals were usually monastic minsters, the regular or monastic clergy continued to the end of the 13th century to dominate ecclesiastical architecture in England. But a monastery, however excellent as a school and refuge for the spirit, is condemned by its seclusion to be a repository of traditions, rather than a theater of living experiment. It is better fitted to preserve than to create. Not until the widened demands of a richer laity nourished secular artists did medieval life find the exuberant expression, in unhackneyed forms, that brought Gothic art to fullness. First in Italy, most in France, least in England, the emancipated and specializing laymen of the 12th century, grouped in guilds, took the arts from monastic teachers and hands and built the great cathedrals. 2. The adornment of life. Nevertheless, it was a monk who wrote the most complete and revealing summary of medieval arts and crafts. Theophilus, lover of God, in the monastery of Helmershausen near Paderborn, wrote about 1190 a Schedula Diversarum Artium. Theophilus, a humble priest, addresses his words to all who wish, by the practical work of their hands, and by the pleasing meditation of what is new, to put aside all sloth of mind and wandering of spirit. Here shall such men find all that Greece possesses in the way of diverse colors and mixtures, all that Tuscany knows of the working of enamels, all that Arabia has to show of works ductile, fusible, or chaste, all the many vases and sculptured gems and ivory that Italy adorns with gold, all that France prizes in costly variety of windows, all that is extolled in gold, silver, copper, or iron, or in subtle working of wood or stone. Here in a paragraph we see another side of the age of faith, men and women, and not least monks and nuns, seeking to satisfy the impulse to expression, taking pleasure in proportion, harmony, and form, and eager to make the useful beautiful. The medieval scene, however suffused with religion, is above all a picture of men and women working, and the first and basic purpose of their art is the adornment of their work, their bodies, and their homes. Thousands of woodworkers used knife, drill, gouge, chisel, and polishing materials to carve tables, chairs, benches, chests, caskets, cabinets, stairposts, wainscots, beds, cupboards, buffets, icons, altarpieces, choir stalls, with an incredible variety of forms and themes in high or low relief, and often with a mischievous humor that recognized no barrier between the sacred and the profane. On the misericords one might find figures of misers, gluttons, gossipers, grotesque beasts and birds with human heads. In Venice, the woodcarvers sometimes made frames more beautiful and costly than the pictures they enclosed. The Germans began in the 12th century that remarkable wood sculpture which would become a major art in the 16th. The workers in metal rivaled the workers in wood. Iron was wrought into elegant gratings for windows, courtyards, and gates, for mighty hinges that spread across massive doors in a variety of floral designs, as on Notre Dame at Paris. For cathedral choir grills as strong as iron and as delicate as lace. Iron or bronze or copper was fused or hammered into handsome vases, goblets, cauldrons, ewers, candelabra, censers, caskets, and lamps. And bronze plates covered many cathedral doors. Armorers liked to add a touch of decoration to swords and scabbards, helmets, breastplates, and shields. The gorgeous bronze chandelier presented to the Cathedral of Aachen by Frederick Barbarossa attested the ability of the German metalworkers, and the great bronze candlestick from Gloucester, circa 1100, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, bears like testimony to English skill. The medieval fondness for making art of the simplest articles shows in the adornment of bolts, locks, and keys. Even weather vanes were carefully decorated with ornament that only a telescope could see. The arts of the precious metals and stones flourished amid general poverty. The Merovingian kings had gold plate, and Charlemagne collected at Aachen a treasure of goldsmiths' work. The Church pardonably felt that if gold and silver brightened the tables of barons and bankers, they should also be used in the service of the King of Kings. Some altars were of chased silver, some of chased gold, as in the Church of St. Ambrose at Milan, and the cathedrals of Pistoia and Basel. Gold was normal for the ciborium, or pyx, that held the consecrated host, for the monstrance in which it was exposed to the veneration of the faithful, for the chalice that contained the sacramental wine, and for the reliquaries in which saintly relics were preserved. These vessels were in many cases more beautifully worked than the most costly prize cups of today. In Spain, the goldsmiths made resplendent tabernacles to bear the host in processions through the streets. In Paris, the goldsmith Bonnard, in 1212, used 1,544 ounces of silver and 60 of gold to make a shrive for the bones of Sainte Geneviève. We may judge the scope of the goldsmith's art from the 79 chapters devoted to it by Theophilus. There we find that every medieval goldsmith was expected to be a Cellini, at once smelter, sculptor, enameler, jewel mounter, and inlay worker. Paris in the 13th century had a powerful guild of goldsmiths and jewelers, and Parisian jewel cutters had already a reputation for producing artificial gems. The seals that rich men used to stamp the wax on their letters or envelopes were carefully designed and carved. Every prelate had an official ring, and every real or specious gentleman flaunted at least one ring on his hands. Those who cater to human vanity seldom starve. Cameos, small reliefs on precious material, were popular among the rich. Henry III of England had a great cameo valued at £200, or $40,000. Baldwin II brought a still more celebrated cameo from Constantinople to house it at Paris in Sainte-Chapelle. Ivory was painstakingly carved throughout the Middle Ages. Combs, boxes, handles, drinking horns, icons, book covers, diptychs and triptychs, episcopal staffs and croziers, reliquaries, shrines. Astonishingly close to perfection is a 13th-century ivory group in the Louvre, depicting the descent from the cross. Towards the end of that century, romance and humor gained upon piety, and delicate carvings of sometimes very delicate scenes appeared on mirror cases and toilet boxes designed for ladies who could not be pious all the time. Ivory was one of many materials used for inlay, which the Italians called intarsia, from the Latin interserere, to insert, and the French termed marqueterie, marquer, to mark. Wood itself might be used as an inlay in other woods. A design was chiseled into a block of wood, and other woods were pressed and glued into the design. One of the more recondite medieval arts was niello, from the Latin nigellus, or black, inlaying an incised metal surface with a black paste composed of silver, copper, sulfur, and lead. When the inlay hardened, the surface was filed till the silver in the mixture shone. From this technique, in the 15th century, Finiguera would develop copperplate engraving. The ceramic arts matured again out of industrial pottery as the returning Crusaders aroused Europe from the Dark Ages. Cloisonné enamel entered the West from Byzantium in the 8th century. In the 12th, the plaque representing the Last Judgment gave an excellent example of champ levé. That is, the spaces between the lines of the design were hollowed out into a copper ground, and the depressions were filled with enamel paste. Limoges, in France, had made enameled wares since the 3rd century. In the 12th, it was the chief centre in the West of champ levé and cloisonné. In the 13th century, Moorish potters in Christian Spain coated clay vessels with an opaque tin glaze or enamel as a base for painted decoration. In the 15th century, Italian merchants imported such wares from Spain in Majorcan trading ships and called the material majolica, changing R to L in their melodious way. The art of glass, so nearly perfected in ancient Rome, returned to Venice from Egypt and Byzantium. As early as 1024 we hear of 12 fiolarii there, whose products were so varied that the government took the industry under its protection and voted the title gentleman to glassmakers. In 1278 the glass workers were removed to a special quarter on the island of Murano, partly for safety, partly for secrecy. Strict laws were passed forbidding Venetian glassmakers to go abroad or to reveal the esoteric techniques of their art. From that foot of earth, the Venetians for 4 centuries dominated the art and industry of glass in the Western world. Enameling and gilding of glass were highly developed. Olivo de Venezia made textiles of glass, and Murano poured out glass mosaic, beads, phials, beakers, tableware, even glass mirrors, which in the 13th century began to replace mirrors of polished steel. France, England, and Germany also made glass in this period, but almost entirely for industrial use. The stained glass of the cathedrals was a brilliant exception. Women have always received less credit in histories of art than they deserved. The adornment of the person and the home are precious elements in the art of life, and the work of women in dress design, interior decoration, embroidery, drapery, and tapestry has contributed more than most arts to that often unconscious pleasure which we derive from the intimate and silent presence of beautiful things. Delicate tissues, deftly woven, and welcome to sight or touch, were highly prized in the age of faith. They clothed altars, relics, sacred vessels, priests, and men and women of high estate. And they themselves were wrapped in soft, thin paper, which took from them its tissue paper name. In the 13th century, France and England dethroned Constantinople as the chief producer of artistic embroidery. We hear of embroiderers' guilds in Paris in 1258, and Matthew Paris, under the year 1246, tells how Pope Innocent IV was struck by the gold-embroidered vestments of English prelates visiting Rome, and ordered such opus Anglicanum for his copes and chasubles. Some ecclesiastical garments were so heavy with jewels, gold thread, and small enamel plaques that the priest so robed could hardly walk. An American millionaire paid $60,000 for an ecclesiastical vestment known as the Cope of Ascoli. The most famous of medieval embroideries was the Dalmatic of Charlemagne. It was believed to be a product of Dalmatia, but was probably a Byzantine work of the 12th century. It is now one of the most precious objects in the treasury of the Vatican. In France and England, embroidered hangings or tapestries took the place of paintings, especially in public buildings. Their full display was reserved for festal days. Then they were hung under the arches of church bays and in the streets and on processional floats. Usually they were woven of wool and silk by the tire women or maids of feudal chateaux under the superintendence of the chatelaine. Many were woven by nuns, some by monks. Tapestries made no pretense to rival the subtler qualities of painting. They were to be seen from some distance and had to sacrifice nicety of line and shading to clarity of figure and brilliance and permanence of color. They commemorated an historical event or a famous legend, or cheered gloomy interiors with representations of landscapes, flowers, or the sea. Tapestries are mentioned as early as the 10th century in France, but the oldest extant full specimens hardly antedate the 14th. Florence in Italy, Chinchilla in Spain, Poitiers, Arras, and Lille in France led the West in the art of tapestry and rugs. The world-renowned Bayeux tapestries were not strictly such, since their design was embroidered upon the surface instead of forming part of the weave. They derived their name from the cathedral of Bayeux that long housed them. Tradition ascribed them to William the Conqueror's Queen Matilda and the ladies of her Norman court, but ungallant scholarship prefers an anonymous origin and a later date. They rival the chronicles as an authority for the Norman conquest. Upon a strip of brown linen 19 inches wide and 71 yards long, 60 scenes show in procession the preparation for the invasion, the Norse vessels cleaving the channel with high and figured prows, the wild battle of Hastings, the transfixing and death of Harold, the rout of the Anglo-Saxon troops, the triumph of blessed force. These tapestries are impressive examples of patient needlework, but they are not among the finer products of their kind. In 1803, Napoleon used them as propaganda to rouse the French to invade England, but he neglected to secure the blessing of the gods. 3. Painting. 1. Mosaic. The pictorial art in the Age of Faith took 4 principal forms: mosaic, miniatures, murals, and stained glass. The mosaic art was now in its old age, but in the course of 2,000 years it had learned many subtleties. To make the gold ground they loved so well, mosaicists wrapped gold leaf around glass cubes, covered the leaf with a thin film of glass to keep the gold from tarnishing, and then, to avoid surface glare, laid the gilded cubes in slightly uneven planes. The light was reflected at diverse angles from the cubes and gave an almost living texture to the whole. It was probably Byzantine artists who in the 11th century covered the east apse and west wall of an old cathedral at Torcello, an island near Venice, with some of the most imposing mosaics in medieval history. This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1.